We are continuing the shiur, and this will be the last part to Heaven in a Day or a Day in Heaven, understanding the sanctity of Shabbat. And perhaps this was the culmination of everything about the Shabbat that we learned, our aspect of it. Till now we understood the holiness of the Shabbat from God's perspective. Now we have to understand the holiness of Shabbat and how we, or our involvement, or our role that we play in the Shabbat. And we will continue along as follows. We're reading inside in a sefer called Netivot Shalom, and we will also be reading as well in Shem Shmuel, and we'll be discussing through that. So the verse says, "Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor." God spoke to Moshe saying, "Daber el bnei Israel." Speak to the Jewish people. "V'amarta lehem," and you should say to them, "Mo'adei Hashem asher tikru otam mikra'e kodesh." The festivals of Hashem, the set times that God has allocated for the festivals, as it says in the Torah, the different dates and the different times, the 15th of Nisan, etc., etc. These are set times that God has allocated to be called holy callings. Elehem Mo'adai, these are my festivals. And then the verse continues and it says an interesting thing. It moves from the festivals and speaks about the Shabbat. Sheshet yamim ta'aseh melacha, 6 days of the week you shall do melacha, you shall do your work. Ubayom hashivei Shabbat Shabbaton mikra kodesh. On the 7th day, Bayom hashivei, on the 7th day, Shabbat Shabbaton, it is a Sabbath of Sabbath. We will understand what that means in a minute. It is a Sabbath of Sabbath. Mikra kodesh, a holy calling. Now Rashi, in the name of Torat Kohanim, says, Ma'inyan Shabbat etzel ha'ma'adot. What connection is there between Shabbat and the festivals? Here the Torah in the Pasuk speaks about the festivals, and it digresses and goes and speaks about the Shabbat. What connection is there? They're very different, the Shabbat. The Shabbat is sanctified by God. The festivals are sanctified by us, by man, through the Beit Din or through the calendar that man has initiated through Hillel. Shabbat was sanctified by God on the 7th day, every 7th day, from the beginning of time until today. Every 7th day is Shabbat, without fail, without any change. Their holiness is totally different. The holiness of Shabbat is far greater than the holiness of the festivals. The restrictions of the Shabbat are far greater than the restrictions of the festivals. On the festivals you're allowed to cook, because it says in the Torah that it allows us to cook on the festivals. Probably to increase the concept of joy, which is something that is associated with the festivals, not so on Shabbat. So he says over here like this. Lelamedcha, to teach you. Shekol ha'machalel et ha'ma'adot, anybody who desecrates the festivals, ma'alin alav, it is considered ki'ilu hilel et ha'shabbatot, as if he desecrated the Shabbat. If a person didn't keep Shavuot or didn't keep Sukkot, it's considered it's if he desecrated the Shabbat. What's the connection? Person desecrated the festival, he desecrated the festivals. Why do we have to attach it to the Shabbat, make a connection to the Shabbat? Doesn't make sense. And here is something even more. Whoever practices and observes the festivals, ma'alin alav, it is considered for him, ki'ilu mekayem et ha-shabbatot, it's as if he has fulfilled and kept holy the Shabbatot. If you keep Sukkot, kol hakavod. You have fulfilled the mitzvah of honoring and sanctifying Sukkot. Why is it harnessed to the Shabbat? So he explains as follows. If a person keeps the Shabbat, it's not as it considered, it's as if he kept this Shabbatot, because he actually kept the Shabbat. And if he doesn't keep the Shabbat, what's it going to help you if you keep the festival? If a person desecrated a Shabbat, is it going to help you that you kept the Sukkot? How will that then justify, how will that then rectify the desecration of the Shabbat? To the extent that the sages say, it's as if he's fulfilled the Shabbatot. How can that be? So he explains over here, he goes on to explain over here, it's not referring to anybody who keeps the festivals, referring to the festivals. It's referring to the dimension of festival that exists in the Shabbat. And let's see. Shekan bepasuk, ayri b'inyan Shabbat. Here the pasuk is talking about the Shabbat. Shabbat Shabbaton Mikra Kodesh, it says. A holy, a Sabbath of Sabbath, a holy calling. Similarly, it says on Yom Kippur, it's also called Shabbat Shabbaton, a double dimension of Shabbat. Only on Yom Kippur, and only on Shabbat, and also in the Shemitah, we will soon see, it's called Shabbat Shabbaton, a Sabbath of Sabbath. The festivals are not called Sabbath of Sabbaths. Why is that? The festivals are referred to at times, besides being called holy callings or God's appointed times, Mu'adim, they are called Shabbaton. Because they're also a day of rest, a day where there is no melacha, where there is no work or toil or creative activity, besides the cooking as we mentioned before. But they're never called Shabbat Shabbaton, they're called Shabbaton. Never Shabbat Shabbaton. Shabbat and Yom Kippur are called Shabbat Shabbaton. Why? Also, it's necessary to understand, in reference to Shabbat, in the Pasuk it calls it Mikra'e Kodesh, a holy calling, an expression that is usually reserved for the festivals. So why is the Shabbat referred to as Shabbat Shabbaton? The festivals are referred to sometimes as Shabbaton. The festivals are ordinarily referred to as holy callings, Mikra'e Kodesh. And here, in this verse, Shabbat is called Shabbat Shabbaton. Mikra'e Kodesh, a holy calling, an expression that is usually reserved for the festivals. So it seems that there is a dimension of the so-called concept of festivals that exists within the Shabbat. Let's see what that means. Sha'arei b'shem Mikra'e Kodesh nikra'im hayamim tovim. Mikra'e Kodesh, a holy calling, is a reference that is referred to and reserved for the festivals. Why? Shekdushatam nimshechet al yedei Israel korim oto. Because the Jewish people call them, proclaim them as holy days. As I mentioned before, we proclaim when the festivals are. The Sanhedrin proclaims through witnesses of when the new moon is, when there is a new moon, based upon that, you know that the cycle of the moon is 21 and a half days. Can't have a half a day. So either it's a full month or a deficient month. If it's a full month, the festivals will be one day later. If it's a deficient month, the festival will be one day earlier. It's going to make a big difference. Therefore, when a festival will be called is totally dependent upon the discretion of the Beth Din, not upon God. The Beth Din. And when we proclaim it a holy day, that is when it is a holy day. It is so serious that we do not put on tefillin on that day. It makes a big difference. We are obligated biblically to put on tefillin every single day. If we get it wrong, which means we are, God forbid, perhaps missing a day when we should be putting on tefillin. Mikra'e Kodesh, God empowered man, God empowered the Jewish people to proclaim its holiness. When we proclaim its holiness, it becomes holy. Suddenly we do not put on tefillin on this day. That's why it's called Mikra'e Kodesh, a holy calling. Because we call it, we proclaim it. Shabbat ordinarily is not called Mikra'e Kodesh, yet we see here in this reference, Shabbat is called with that term that is usually reserved for the festivals. Why is that so? Let's just finish the point and we'll take the question. Kidita me'Arizal, Pri Etz Chaim, as the holy Arizal, the great Kabbalist in Pri Etz Chaim, in his book Pri Etz Chaim, writes, his student actually wrote it. Lachen Shabbat nikra Kodesh, Kidichtiv, Shabbat is actually called holy, because as it says in Shemot, Ushmartem et HaShabbat ki Kodesh hi lachem. You shall keep the Shabbat, for it is holy for you. Why? Mitam shah Shabbat mikadesha v'kayama. Shabbat is sanctified eternally. God sanctified it, and it continues to be sanctified by the mere fact that God proclaimed its holiness. Not dependent upon me. I can't decide Shabbat will be in Tuesday, Shabbat will be on Wednesday. It's got nothing to do with me, nothing to do with the Beis Din. Nobody can change that. The festivals, however, is totally dependent upon our ability to transpose, to impregnate time with holiness, with sanctity. So on the one hand, there is a quality to Shabbat that the festivals do not have, the holiness that is far surpasses, supersedes the holiness of the festival. But there's a quality of the festival that Shabbat does not have. And that is the fact that my involvement, my interaction, or human interaction, or the Beis Din's interaction, the Sanhedrin's interaction, in proclaiming its holiness. That's a powerful thing. That's an important thing. God wants that interaction. And that comes mikoach achanatam v'avodatam. That comes from their preparation and from their service. And that's why they're called holy callings, because we proclaim them holy. We call them holy. For this reason, in the prayers on Shabbat, we say, Mekadesh HaShabbat. We say that God sanctifies the Shabbat. When it comes, because it's got no connection to me, God sanctifies it, independent upon me. However, when it comes to the festivals, and that we mentioned in the last year, Mekadesh Yisrael v'hazemanim. God, the blessing that we say in the prayer and in the Kiddush, God sanctifies the Jewish people and the festivals, the zmanim, the set times. Why? Through the power of the holiness that God empowered us, we have the ability to transpose that holiness into an ordinarily weekday and make that into a holy day. And that's a great quality. And that is something that is dependent upon us. Now we begin to understand why Shabbat is also called Mikra Kodesh, a holy calling. Why? Because there must be, although Shabbat, and that's why it says, you know what, I'll read it inside, and we'll better to read inside. Therefore he continues and he says, Shabbat nikra Kodesh, Shabbat is called holy, mitam shekedushata keviyah v'kayama. Shabbat is called holy because its holiness is set and established and eternal. However, the festivals are called holy callings because we call them, we proclaim them, as we mentioned before. Now, aside from the holiness that exists in Shabbat, there also exists the second quality. The quality that is usually reserved for the festival also is included in the Shabbat. That's why the Shabbat is also called Mikra Kodesh, holy. It's called Shabbat, and Shabbat, God proclaimed its holiness, but it also has an element of Mikra Kodesh. Mikra Kodesh meaning to say something that is reserved for the festivals, or a quality that exists in the festivals, and that is our interaction. Because although Shabbat is holiness is proclaimed by God, but there exists room for our involvement in the Shabbat, and that is through our preparation, both emotionally, both spiritually, mentally, and physically. The more we prepare for the Shabbat, the more then we are able to feel the sanctity that God proclaimed on this day. But that is the dimension that is dependent upon us, and that is a dimension that exists predominantly and primarily in the festivals. So that is why that term that is reserved for the festivals is added on, is appendixed to the Shabbat. To teach us, yes, God sanctified the Shabbat, but there's a dimension of the Shabbat that is dependent upon us. That we have to do, that we have to be involved with. And that is very important. We cannot just rely upon the fact that, yes, God proclaimed the Shabbat, sit at home and bask in its holiness. We have to make it. We have to make it happen. And this is very crucial. As we will soon learn, it is extremely crucial. Because if we, and he continues and says, if we are to perceive and feel the spirituality of the Shabbat, you're not going to feel it just sitting at home playing cards. You may keep Shabbat 100%, not desecrated in the slightest. But if you're sitting at home playing cards, if you're sitting at home just having a great rest and playing sheshbesh and tawli, you're not going to feel its sanctity. Prepare yourself. That's why people go to the mikveh before the Shabbat. We get dressed in fine clothes on the Shabbat. We study before and during the Shabbat to begin to feel its holiness and sanctity that we spoke about in the first and the second shiurim. How do we do that? Through our own involvement, through our preparation, through our inner refinement, and through our prayers, our focus in our prayers on the Shabbat, our concentration in the prayers on the Shabbat. And for this reason, Shabbat is mentioned in the Parashat Moadei Hashem Shetikru Atam, Mikra Kodesh, and right afterwards we speak about the Shabbat, the concept of the festivals, and then we speak about the Shabbat, because that element of the festivals that is our interaction is borrowed, must be borrowed and implemented in the Shabbat. And for this reason, there is a double expression on the Shabbat which doesn't exist on the festivals. The festivals are referred to at times as Shabbaton. Shabbat is referred to as Shabbat Shabbaton. Yom Kippur is referred to as Shabbat Shabbaton. Why? The two dimensions. Because Shabbat has a dimension that God sanctified it, and Shabbat must also have the ingredient that we sanctify it as well. That's why you get the double expression. The festivals, you don't have that because God didn't sanctify it. He allowed it for us to sanctify. It's a great quality, but it doesn't have the other quality. Shabbat can have both qualities. And that's why specifically Shabbat is me'ain olam haba, is akin to the world to come. Because it is the preparation to the world to come is dependent upon our preparation in this world, in this physical world that we exist in. And we will speak about this a little bit more later. And that's why we have an expression in the Torah that says, Et shabbatotai tishmoru, in a plural sense. You should just say, keep my Shabbat. Why et shabbatotai, my Sabbaths keep? Because the two dimension, the duplicity of the Shabbat. The sanctity that God sanctifies and the sanctity that we can add, or we will be able to feel God's sanctity through how we are sanctifying ourselves. And this concept exists about really everything. In every mitzvah, there is a sanctity inherent in the mitzvah, and the ability to feel, or when we study Torah, for example, is very much dependent upon our personal preparation. The more we prepare, the more we invest, the more we're able to be spiritually uplifted. That is a rule, that's a klal in the service of God. And absolutely so by Shabbat. And we find this in regards to the Kiddush. We find this double expression in the Kiddush. בתחילה אומרים, בשבת קודשו, באהבה ורצון, הנחילנו, זיכרון למעשה בראשית. First we come along and we say that God sanctified the Shabbat, באהבה ורצון, with love and with desire. הנחילנו, He has given us this inheritance. זיכרון למעשה בראשית, as a commemoration for the act of creation, which is the original Shabbat. And then afterwards we say, Tehillah lemikrai kodesh, it is the beginning of all holy callings. What did we say holy callings are? Is a reference referred to the festivals. It is the beginning of all holy callings. Which means to say that we on the one hand accept the fact that God sanctified the Shabbat, but on the other hand, it has the holy calling dimension that is totally dependent upon us. And this is what we mentioned before as well, right in the beginning, when we started this essay here, of which we said that any person who wants to sanctify, God implemented for the holy nation that he calls us the holy nation, Goy Kadosh, a system by which we sanctify ourselves. We have the ability to extricate ourselves from the material world, not to be so sunken deep in the material world. What is that? One of the main ingredients, one of the most powerful ingredients? Tehillah lemikrai kodesh, the very beginning of everything that is called holy, that is the Shabbat. Anybody who wants to really be uplifted spiritually, through the Shabbat. Because of its sanctity, because of its spiritual infusion of holiness, a godly infusion of holiness. Aside from the fact that we spoke about before, it is a powerful statement, a powerful testimony of the fact that you believe in God. And you believe in God absolutely, not in an abstract manner. You are expressing every Shabbat that you have an absolute reliance, a belief and reliance on God, because you don't work on the Shabbat. God says not to work, your boss says to work. Is God abstract or is God real? If God is real, then you will listen to God. If God is abstract, yeah, there's a God, but God understands. Often people tell me, God will forgive me, I did this and this and this and this and this. God doesn't need the Shabbat for you. You need the Shabbat for you. God doesn't have anything extra or anything less by you keeping the Shabbat. It's you that needs it. It is a very powerful expression of our faith in God. And therefore, it is the very first steps for us to become a holy nation. Now, this is very crucial, and this is very important. This is really the points where I want to get to. And I'm skipping a little bit. V'yesh lehosif bi'ur bazeh. One can add an explanation to this. Dihinei ha-Shabbat nikra shvi'i v'nikra Shabbat. Sometimes the Shabbat is called shvi'i. Sheshet yamim ta'avoda v'yom ha-shvi'i Shabbat. 6 days you should work, and on the 7th day it is Shabbat holy. Sometimes the Shabbat is referred to as the 7th day. Sometimes the Shabbat is referred to as the Shabbat. What is shvi'i? It is 7th after 6. 6 days preceded it, which means to say that there is a connection of the Shabbat that is associated with the 6 days that preceded it, i.e. the 6 days of preparation. And then there is a concept of Shabbat that is beyond anything that we can give. And that is Shabbat Kodesh LaHashem. Shabbat Shabbaton Kodesh LaHashem. It is holy to Hashem. Now, when we refer to the Shabbat on its own, it refers to the element of Shabbat that is beyond time, beyond the connection or the relationship to the 6 days preceding it, but rather a new beginning, a beginning for the new week. Because ki Shabbat Kodesh ithatshut abriya, because the Shabbat on this element, on this dimension, on this level, is a reenactment of the whole purpose of creation, as we learned before. The Shabbat, and I think it was the third shiur, is the very purpose of the whole creation. It legitimizes all of creation. And therefore, if there is a Shabbat, then there is a continuity to the world and to the next coming week. And as the Ramban writes, never has passed a Shabbat where there was not one tzaddik in the world that kept the Shabbat. For it is the Shabbat that really infuses energy, vitality, spirituality for the next coming days of the week. And it's impossible without it. The Or HaChaim HaKadosh writes that really God created the world for 6 days, the whole 6 days for the Shabbat, in a cycle of 6 days in the Shabbat, and that's it. If there is a Shabbat, then there is the next 6 days, and then the Shabbat. Because the Shabbat, as I said before, legitimizes the essence, the whole of creation, because the Shabbat is the epoch and the apex of all of creation. If there's a Shabbat that's kept, the infusion of the holiness of the Shabbat, what the Shabbat represents, of which we spoke about in the previous Shurim, or we're not going to go back and repeat it all now, then this legitimizes the existence of the world for the next week, and the next week, and the next week, and the next week after that. So there is the duplicity of this concept of the Shabbat. The Shabbat, as it refers to in connection to the 6 days, Sheshet Yamim Ta'avot, 6 days a week you shall work, and then there is a Shabbat. So there is a relationship between the 6 days of the week, our involvement in preparing for the Shabbat, and then there's Shabbat as it stands solo on its own, as a force for the next coming days, to legitimize the existence of the next coming days. And it continues and it says, Kedita b'Or HaHaim HaKadosh, as the Or HaHaim, one of the great commentaries, Rabbi Chaim ben Attar writes in his commentary, Shakadosh Baruch Hu bara et ha'olam lishisha yamim bilvad. God created the world only for 6 days. Ubechol Shabbat Kodesh, and every Shabbat there is a concept of renewal. Yeshna hatshut habriya lishisha yamim nosafim, for another 6 days, and so on and so forth. When a person wants to renew himself, sometimes we just want to have just a new beginning. We just feel that we're upset and just, things are not going right, and just we want to release ourselves from the past. You want to, almost like be reborn again. Shabbat, because the Shabbat is like a rebirth. It's a rebirth of the whole world. The word Shabbat contains the letters Tashuv, return. Everything returns back to its original source. So anybody who feels that they want some renewal within themselves, some spiritual injection and renewal, the Shabbat does it. One can reach that renewal through the Shabbat. And that is a connection to the festivals, as we said before. We said whoever keeps the festival, it's as if he keeps the Shabbat. And whoever keeps the Shabbat, it's as if he keeps the festivals. That is figuratively speaking, not literally speaking. It means to say the dimension of the Shabbat that is connected to the festivals, i.e. our participation, our involvement, our connection. If we add that, then we've actually kept the Shabbat properly. Shabbaton, the two dimensions of the Shabbat. And one impacts the other. When you want renewal, when you want to renew your life, when you want to renew your spiritual energy and your connection to it, you keep the Shabbat. That infuses you with the ability of the concept of what's festivals. Festivals is your ability to infuse the world and the mundane with holiness. So one feeds upon the other. And I'm skipping, and he over here says a very interesting thing. Pertaining to this it says, Sheva Shabbatot Temimot Tihiyena. When the Jewish people left Egypt, we were commanded to count down 7 weeks. Like the Shabbat is the 7th. We were commanded to count down 7 weeks until the giving of the Torah. Just like there is a Shabbat in days, there's a Shabbat in weeks, there's a Shabbat in years, and there's a Shabbat in sabbaticals. The Jubilee is a Shabbat of sabbaticals. Right? The 49th year is 7 times 7 years. So there's a concept of 7 days. 7 weeks is a preparation. So 7 days is a preparation, 6 days is a preparation for the Shabbat. And that infuses the next 6 days. Then there's a concept of the sabbatical, the 7 years, where 1 year off we take off from plowing the field, etc. And then there's the Jubilee in years. So there is in days, in weeks, as a preparation for the giving of the Torah. There were 7 weeks. And then there is years, and then there is the Jubilee.
What is the Yovel?
Yovel is 7 times 7 years.
That's the Yovel.
That's the Jubilee. That's the Jubilee. That's the Yovel. ועל זה נאמר 7 שבתות תמימות תהיינה. You shall proclaim, you shall count 7 complete weeks until Shavuot. מכיוון שקבלת התורה קשורה לשבת, since the receiving of the Torah is very much intertwined and intimately connected to the Shabbat. For it's just as Shabbat is the soul of the days of the week, the Torah is the soul of the whole creation. As our rabbis have said, Mesechet Shabbat, D'chula alma b'Shabbat nitna Torah l'Israel. Guess which day of the week? Everybody agrees. Guess which day of the week the Torah was given to the Jewish people? Which day of the week do you think? Was it Tuesday? Was it a Wednesday? 7:30 at night? It was on a Shabbat. God chose the Shabbat as the day to give the Torah. And all of the connection is obvious. That's why when we count the 7 weeks, they must be complete. Because we must prepare for the Shabbat. We must prepare for the giving of the Torah. Just like we prepare for the Shabbat through the 6 days of the week. And then there's the 7th day. So too, the giving of the Torah, we count down as a preparation for the giving of the Torah. Having said that, and understood all of this, there's something very important that I want to share with you, which is really the culmination of everything here, and that is from a book called Shem Shmuel, and he brings a very interesting point, a very interesting phenomenon. He says as follows: V'nira, and it seems, Dihine b'chol makom shemuskeret Shabbat, wherever you find Shabbat mentioned in the Torah, in the Bible, nichtavu lefaneha, it's written beforehand, Sheshet Yamim, Sheshet Yamei HaMaaseh, the 6 days of the week. Sheshet Yamim Ta'avod, V'yom HaShavi Shabbat, 6 days of the week you shall work, on the 7th day Shabbat. So wherever it says Shabbat, you will find previously it speaks about the preceding weekdays. Why? Niradi ine lefi ma'alata u'gdulata shel Shabbat, because of the wondrous quality of the Shabbat that is akin to the world to come. And this is how we started the shiur. A day in heaven or heaven in a day. Shabbat is heaven in a day. Is the world to come in this day. For the world to come, what's the world to come? It's the very soul of all of the purpose of creation. Shabbat is the soul of time, the soul of the whole week. So Shabbat is akin to the world to come. How do we achieve the world to come? Who can tell me? Is the world to come just going to come just like that? By sitting and playing cards? Through our service in this world, through our overcoming our own inhibitions, weaknesses, temptations, and passions, our own desires, and showing strength of character and spiritual maturity, that is how we are going to herald in the world to come. It takes preparation, it takes toil, it takes effort. Same with the Shabbat. Notice, the Shabbat, before the Shabbat, is preceded by 6 weekdays. These 6 weekdays are a battle. It's a struggle to find spirituality during those 6 days, is it not? But that is exactly and precisely how you will find the sanctity of the Shabbat. Through trying to refine the mundane, the physical activities and existence of this world, that is how you will feel the Shabbat. Listen to what he says, very interesting. Listen to what he says. שהיא מעין העולם הבא. Shabbat is akin to the world to come. אי אפשר לזכות בה. One cannot merit its sanctity and its holiness, אלא על ידי מה שהאיש משליך ממנו, only through the fact that a person toils with effort to remove from himself טרדות המלאכות וטרדות הפרנסה של ששת ימי המעשה. When a person removes from himself the mundane mentality, thinking about work, thinking about more money, thinking about more leisures, about doing this and about doing that, and about gaining and doing and getting and buying and selling. When you're able to do that, ופורק ממנו עול חשבונות הרבים, and when he removes from himself this yoke of the mundane, of the material, of all of the calculations and ideas and mundane material things that we think about and we strive for and we desire and we want, when you're able to remove yourself somewhat, live in the material world, but live above it at the same time, זוכין לעומת זה לקדושת Shabbat. That's where you merit the Shabbat. That's how you merit the Shabbat. And this is what we said before in the other book, Netivot Shalom, that is the dimension of the Yom Tov, or the human dimension that exists within the Shabbat. That is the 6 days of the week, as we mentioned before. And we mentioned that the world to come is similar. We said that Shabbat is akin to the world to come. Just like Shabbat is acquired through our living in the 6 days of the week, but not becoming so sunken deep that we are so jailed. We are prisoned to the material world. We can extricate ourselves. And we prepare for the Shabbat mentally, emotionally, etc. So too with the redemption. And we said that just as God created 6 days of the week and then there is a Shabbat, God created 6 millenniums. And then there is the seventh, so to speak, the time of the redemption. So there is a similarity between the 6 days of the week and Shabbat and the 6 millenniums and the world to come. Just as Shabbat needs its preparation, and through our involvement and preparation and living in this world, simultaneously extricating ourselves from this world, not losing focus, not becoming so sunken deep in the materialism of this world that we forget everything. We forget who we are and what we are, our identities. We forget what our purpose and goal in life is. That's how the world to come works, exactly the same way. Through our preparation, through the trials that we go through in this world. Like the world to come. Because of its greatness, its spirituality, it doesn't come on its own. It's got to come through our toil, through our effort. One cannot merit it. Only from he who learns how to live in this world, but to distance himself from the world at the same time. To purify himself simultaneously. And as a great rabbi that he quotes says, Hidushei Harim, he writes, Ke'en she'ita bezohar HaKadosh, and similarly, as is written in the Holy Zohar, shekol ma she'adam boreach mechotzoniyut, the more that one flees from the facade of the world, from the externals and the extremities of the world, the facade of the world, ba'al umato bepnimiyut, he acquires the inner dimension, the soul of everything. And as we said on a previous shurim, that Shabbat is the soul of the world. Just like it says that God created all of the world and then he created man, so too created the 6 days of the week and he created Shabbat. So too the 6 millennium and the world to come. It's a pattern. It's all the same. How does one acquire the inner dimension, the soul, the spirit? Through toil, through effort. through prayer, through study, through inquiring. And here we find a pattern for this. And he says, כמו שכתוב, in regards to Moshe Rabbeinu, ויברח משה מפני פרעה, and Moshe fled from Paro. We know that Paro represents a very deep level of impurity. Paro is the letters Oref, Ha'oref, which means turning your back, giving you the back of your neck, turning your back on everything spiritual, everything godly. When Moshe Rabbeinu, so to speak, turned his back upon Paro, he faced, so to speak, God. When you flee from evil, you find the good. As David HaMelech says, Sur mera va'aseh tov. Flee from bad and do good. How do you do good? How do you acquire good? How do you become attracted to good? By fleeing bad. The more you flee from negativity or the externals or the facade of the world or the materialism of the world, we get a great kick out of materialism of the world. We love this, we love that. We eat this, we eat that, we do this, we do that. Oh, I love this, oh, I love that. You hear people's conversation, oh, I love this. Did you like that? Oh, I like that. Oh, I saw this the other day, it was great. I love that one. Oh, I love this. Oh, I don't like this. The whole time you hear people's conversation, you go on a bus, all you need to do is go on a train, you hear, oh, I love this, I love it this way, I love it with the chili, and I love it with the this, and I love it with the that. I love and I love and I love. Where do you hear about the spirituality? Well, that takes effort. So we got to learn how to distance ourselves a little bit from the material. Start loving the good things, the spiritual things, the inner dimensions. How do we do that? By minimizing our dependency upon the material world. Oh, then we begin to feel a little bit more spiritual. And then what happened to Moshe Rabbeinu? Vayeshev al ha'be'er. He sat upon the well. The well is a sign of Torah. Water is a sign of Torah. And that was his beginning to godly revelation when God revealed himself. He married Tzipporah. There was a revelation of the burning bush, etc., etc. When did it happen? Only when he fled from Paro. Meaning to say, when he left behind everything. Not that Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't holy and pure in Egypt, he was. But that extra sanctity was when he totally left behind Paro. Because the more we leave, the more we run away from the facade and the materialism of this world, the more we're able to engage in spirituality, feel it, and be uplifted by it. ואילו יצאו העדר התרחקות מהעולם הזה, if we to imagine that we will not distance ourselves from the materialism of this world, לא היה במה לזכות לעולם הבא. There is no way, there's no possibility to merit and herald in the future redemption, the world to come. Because it's like the Shabbat. כעין זהו שבת מעין עולם הבא. Exactly, Shabbat is like this, like the world to come. שאילו יצאו העדר ששת ימי המעשה. If you were to imagine a Shabbat without the preparation of the 6 days prior to it, לא היה במה לזכות בקדושת שבת. With what are you going to merit to feel the Shabbat? So Shabbat becomes like another day. It's holy, so you keep it by rote because you have no choice. The Torah says, keep the Shabbat, so you keep the Shabbat. But how do you feel the Shabbat? How do you engage the Shabbat? By preparing for the 6 days. And that's why the Shem Shmuel writes that you'll never find a place that Shabbat is written in the Torah without the 6 days being mentioned before. Because it's crucial. And that's what he wrote over here in Netivat Shalom. The concept of Mikra'e Kodesh, Shabbat, is also that term that is reserved for the festivals, is appendix to the Shabbat from time to time to teach us that Shabbat also needs our preparation, our involvement, if we are to feel the Shabbat. Not that the Shabbat needs it in order to heighten its sanctity. Its sanctity comes from God. But if you are to feel it, then you need the toil and the preparation before. And really, this is what the culmination, really, of all of the shiurim that we've had about the Shabbat. This is the essence of it all. What role do we play in the Shabbat? What are we willing to do to feel for the Shabbat? We know how holy the Shabbat is. The Gemara tells us that God says, in my treasure house I have a gift for you. Shabbat Shema, and its name is Shabbat. Shabbat is tashuv, is the letters tashuv, returning, a renewal. God has given us the opportunity, the mechanism, the system by which to extricate ourselves from the material world, to lift ourselves from the material world, to lift our game, to be included in the holiness and the sanctity of the revelation of God that exists on the Shabbat. As we mentioned on the first shiur, that the level of the Shabbat is the level of thought, it is much more intimate relationship with God. The 6 days of the week is the level of speech. Just like speech is much lower within me. It's not as intimate as my thoughts, not as powerful as my thoughts. So too, the 6 days of the week are connected to the concept of God said, let there be this and let there be this. God created the world through the metaphor of speech. But Shabbat is the metaphor of thought. Which leads me to the final idea that I want to mention to you today. There's another concept, if I have time, I'll just throw it in, but we'll see. We have two sets of 10 commandments. One written in Parashat Yitro, and one written in Parashat Vayet Hanan. On the first set, that the 10 Commandments are mentioned twice. Once when God revealed them on Har Sinai, and the second time Moshe Rabbeinu was recounting the 10 Commandments that he went and brought from God the second time round, and there the version is a little bit different. There is a couple of different words there. One of the different words is as follows in regards to the Shabbat. On the first set of 10 Commandments it says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadesho. Remember the Shabbat to make it holy, to sanctify it. In the second set it says, Shamor et Yom HaShabbat. Keep the Shabbat, guard the Shabbat. What's the difference between Zachor and what's the difference between Shamor? Our sages tell us that really both dimensions of Zachor and Shamor are necessary for the Shabbat. Because Zachor is more one of an emotional, an intellectual, or a spiritual engagement. And Shamor is one of more of the physical dimension of the Shabbat. That you have to keep the Shabbat, guard the Shabbat, make sure we don't desecrate the Shabbat. You need both. You cannot just have someone who puts on, the beautiful Shabbat clothes, and he sings nicely Lecha Dodi, or the Mizmor Shel Yom HaShabbat in the morning on the way to work. Doesn't work. You need both. Although it's better than nothing. Better than the guy listening to Michael Jackson on his earphones on the way to work. At least something. At least he's commemorating Shabbat something. I'm not belittling, but it doesn't work. You need both. Neither can you have just a Shamor, someone who comes and keeps a Shabbat, but he's sitting and playing cards on the Shabbat. There's no Zachor, there's no spirit to the Shabbat. You need both. That's why the sages say that when God spoke the 10 Commandments, they heard both. They heard both dimensions. So my question is, because it's obvious you need both, because the Torah clearly says and stipulates that you shall not do any work, etc., etc. You shall remember the Shabbat and not do any work, etc., etc. So it's obvious that you need both. My question is, why is it that the Zachor aspect of the Shabbat is mentioned in Parashat Yitro, the first 10 Commandments, so to speak? And the Shamor dimension, which again was revealed simultaneously, is reserved and mentioned in the second 10 Commandments. If they were indeed heard together, why aren't they mentioned simultaneously? Or if you want to be able, for whatever reason, to separate them, then why not reverse the order? Why not Shamor in the first 10 Commandments in Parashat Yitro, the first set that was recorded in the Torah, and one not Zachor in the later one. The reason is because the first 10 commandments that were given before Moshe Rabbeinu shattered them was given to a nation before they sinned. They're on a much higher level. Of course, you have to have the shamor dimension, the guarding and the keeping of the physical laws and precepts of the Shabbat. But the predominant focus was the Zachor, the spiritual dimension. Zachor is something in the mind. You remember the Shabbat in your mind. Shamor is keeping the Shabbat bodily, physically. They were a nation before they sinned which were on a high spiritual level. You're talking about a nation who just saw phenomenal miracles in Egypt. Phenomenal revelation at the splitting of the sea, where it says that even the most lowest person, the most simplest person, even a maidservant, saw revelations that the prophets did not see at the splitting of the sea. What were the revelations then in Har Sinai? If the revelations in Egypt were so great, they saw a level of Shekhinah, of the divine presence in Egypt. Then on the splitting of the sea, they saw such divine revelation of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence that was unbelievable. So then, what then was the revelation on Har Sinai? Beyond any human imagination. So the revelations that they had, coupled with their preparation, both the preparation of the fact that God pulled them out of Egypt, that God showed them all of these things, and the preparation that they themselves prepared themselves by counting down the 7 weeks, like one prepares for the Shabbat through the 6 days of creation and then proclaims the Shabbat holy. So the revelation that they were on, the level that they, spiritual level was phenomenal, was sublime. Because they're on such a level, the focus was on the Zachor, the mind, the intellect, a higher aspect of the Shabbat. This was the one that were most able to feel and to relate to. Like we said, the 6 days of the week relate to more speech, God's speech. And the 7th day, the Shabbat, refers to God's thought. It's much more intimate. So too in Shabbat, there's the 2 dimensions. There's the more intimate dimension of the Shabbat, and there's a more practical level of the Shabbat. And of course, you need both, as I said before. But what was the predominant focus? They felt the Zachor side, the spiritual, the more intimate dimension of the Shabbat with God, the intellectual part, the spiritual part much more. Later, when Moshe Rabbeinu broke the tablets, there were no lower level. There were already people who sinned. True, they repented, and repentance is a very great thing, but they were never on the same levels they were before. So although, of course, you need the Zachor, and without the Zachor, what is Shabbat? But now the focus is addressing a people who were post-sin. Ones that are prone more to desecrate the material side of the Shabbat. Because we've become much more material, we need to be careful much more on the Shabbat because we are prone to desecrate even the material part of the Shabbat. The generation prior to the sin were on the level of Zachor, on a much higher plane. Therefore, the focus to them was, how do we acquire the Zachor, the spiritual dimension of the Shabbat? The physical dimension of the Shabbat goes without even saying. Because they felt the holiness of Shabbat, it goes without saying that they weren't nowhere near going to desecrate the Shabbat. But now came a generation that we need now to be careful because we've become much more material. We have to be careful, or the focus became on the Shamor. Be careful. We become much more material. We become sunken and sullied by the material world. We have to be careful because there's not that big a distance when we become much more material to desecrating even not only the Zachor side of the Shabbat, not only the spirit and the spiritual side of the Shabbat, but the Shamor side of the Shabbat, the physical side of the Shabbat as well. So the focus now becomes, hey, be careful. We've sinned once. We're prone to sin. We're prone to get too much engaged in the material world. Be careful, because the Shabbat is that which pulls us, protects us from becoming overly involved in the physical world. We'll stop here. There was a question.
Yom Kippur is
You mean after 45 minutes I still didn't manage to answer your question?
Yom Kippur, would we proclaim it, or is it God proclaimed
Well, Yom Kippur has both dimensions because Hashem says, "Lifnei Hashem titaharu." Before Hashem, you shall become holy. So what makes the Yom Kippur so holy? Like the Shabbat. And if you notice, on Yom Kippur, you're not allowed to cook. Yom Kippur, if it falls out on a Tuesday, you have the same laws as the Shabbat. No cooking. Exactly like Shabbat, Yom Kippur. Besides the eating that we don't eat, that's in addition. So Yom Kippur is exactly like Shabbat. So it has that dimension, A, of the Shabbat, and the Shabbaton, the fact that we proclaim it. So it's got both. Any other questions? Okay, we'll stop here.
So those books, what are they? Es Chaim,